If you mess up your punctuation, it can limit your GRA score to band 6 or lower. In this video, I'll go through some basic English punctuation rules and show you some example mistakes along with their corrected versions. Just to show you how punctuation matters in the IELTS, it comes under grammatical range and accuracy, and if you look in the band descriptors, you'll see that for a band 7, the candidate has good control of grammar and punctuation. Compare this to a band 6, the candidate makes some errors in grammar and punctuation, but they rarely reduce communication. So they don't have as good control as a band 7. And then a band 5, they may make frequent grammatical errors and punctuation may be faulty. Errors can cause some difficulty for the reader. Those errors include grammar and punctuation, one or the other or both. So what is the most common mistake with punctuation that I see? Well, it's firstly the comma. This is very, very often misused. And secondly, it's the full stop. And these two should be quite simple to use. I mean, these are things that I think native English speakers would learn these in primary school, in the early grades of primary school. Firstly, I'll show you how to add a comma or a full stop. Commas go immediately at the end of a word. For example, although modern technologies have improved the life of workers, comma, I am of the firm belief that, etc., etc. Now, a common mistake is to put a space before the comma, like this. Although modern technologies have improved the life of workers, space, comma, space, I'm of the firm belief that. Now, that would not cause difficulty for the reader, but it looks wrong, so that would be the mark of a 6. And the same rule applies to full stops. So you put a full stop immediately at the end of a word. Don't put a space after the word before the full stop. Knowing how to add a comma or a full stop is not very difficult, as long as you don't put the space before the comma or before the full stop, and you leave a space after the comma or after the full stop. That's pretty easy. But knowing when to use them is the tricky part. Firstly, I'm going to show you where to add a full stop. I think most people already know they should go at the end of every sentence. For example, private vehicles, full stop, new sentence. Governments must look to certain model cities for inspiration and design ideas. Now, a common mistake is to use a comma instead of a full stop. As you can see, after the word vehicles, there's a comma, and then the next word has a lowercase g for governments. The reason why it's wrong is because you can see the word governments is a new subject. So you have a subject and then a verb, so you have a new sentence. So where should you add a comma? Well, the first situation is after a leading conjunctive adverb or adverbial phrase. I say leading because it starts the sentence. For example, in task 1, if you were writing about a process diagram, then you might write a sentence like, firstly, the beets are unloaded from the truck. Now the word firstly is a leading conjunctive adverb. Or an adverbial phrase, which is very similar, but it just means it has more than one word. For example, after this, they are washed in a beet washer. Or in your overview, you might write, according to the diagram. The process involves many steps and pieces of equipment. In task 2, you might write, however, and you need a comma after that. Or, for example, or in conclusion. Okay, so the second situation where you need to add a comma is between two independent clauses. An independent clause contains a subject and a verb. And the second independent clause has to begin with a conjunctive adverb and, but, or, so, or yet. If you don't use a conjunctive adverb, then you need to use a full stop, as I showed you before. For example, the pursuit of happiness is common to most, if not all, humans alike, comma, but what constitutes happiness differs from person to person. So the green text is the first independent clause, and the purple text is the second independent clause. You can write these two as separate sentences, using a full stop after each one, and no conjunctive adverb. Okay, so remember, if you want to use a comma to join them, you can, but you need to use a conjunctive adverb with the comma. And here's a simple example, if the previous one was a little tricky to understand. I prefer strawberry, but my brother likes chocolate. The independent clause 1 is I prefer strawberry. Independent clause 2, my brother likes chocolate. Okay, so I don't advise you to write these short independent sentences because they're known as simple sentences. Subject, verb, blah, 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 full stop. Okay, so you want to join them if possible. And if you do use a conjunctive adverb with a comma, you make a compound sentence. That's better than a simple sentence, but it's not as good as a complex sentence. Okay, so I'll move on and I'll show you what that means. Before I do that, I'll show you where not to add a comma. So in a compound sentence, if the subject is the same in both clauses, then it's duplicated and you can remove it. So I'll give you an example. I like strawberry, but I don't like chocolate. So I'm using a comma because the second clause has a subject before the verb. So it is an independent clause. So you need to use a comma. Now I changed it in the second line by removing the duplicate subject I. In that case, you don't use a comma before the conjunctive adverb. Moving on. And a similar but more difficult example, okay, I'll let you read that. So pause the video and you can read it and see the two sentences mean the same thing. Another place where you need to add a comma is after a leading subordinate clause. Now I mentioned earlier that we were forming compound sentences and they're better than simple sentences but not as good as a complex sentence. Now this is how you make a complex sentence. You put a comma after a leading subordinate clause. A subordinate clause begins with a subordinating conjunction, such as although, despite, even though, if only, once, whereas, while, etc. For example, despite being difficult to define, happiness is a goal pursued by everyone. So the green text is the subordinate clause, then there's a comma to separate it from the main clause. So if you break this sentence up into two parts, like I did with the previous example, you'll see that the subordinate clause is an incomplete sentence. There's no subject there. It needs the main clause to complete it. Whereas the main clause does have a subject, so it is complete. It doesn't need the subordinate clause. So if you put these two together, well, you actually need to if you are writing the subordinate clause, then you're making a complex sentence. And these are the types of sentences that will get you a 7 in writing. If you make mistakes with these, then you might still score a 6. As long as the mistakes don't cause too much difficulty for the reader. But if you do make mistakes which cause difficulty for the reader with complex sentences, then you'll still be limited to a 5. Okay, so you do need a comma when the subordinate clause is at the beginning of the sentence, but if the subordinate clause comes second, then you don't use a comma. For example, same sentence in a different order. Happiness is a goal pursued by everyone, despite being difficult to define. And another place where you need to add a comma is to separate items in a list. And this one's not too difficult. You probably already know it. For example, there were 4 students in the class. Nico, comma, Samir, comma, Yusuf, and Indra. Now this is the British English version, and the standard American English version is the same, except you'll notice that there's a comma here. Okay, just some notes about this example, or this situation where you are separating items in a list. The final list item begins with an and or an or. In British English, the final list item does not need to be separated with a comma, but in standard American English it does need a comma to separate it, and IELTS accepts either British English or standard American English. Okay, here's a text that you can use to practice everything that I've just taught you. I've copied it into the description, so if you prefer to read it there, you can. There are quite a few mistakes with punctuation, either with a comma or the full stop, so you should be able to fix this now. Just some hints. There is one error on each of lines 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and 9. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next video.